The presidency of Corazon C.Aquino spanned for 6 years from February 25, 1986 to June 30, 1992. Overview: the triumph of the peaceful people power revolution and the ascension of Corazon Aquino into power signaled the end of authoritarian rule in the Philippines and the dawning of a new era for Filipinos. The relatively peaceful manner by which Aquino came into power drew international acclaim and admiration not only for her but for the Filipino people as well. During the first months of Aquino's presidency, the country experienced radical changes and sweeping democratic reforms. One of Aquino's first and boldest moves was the creation of the Presidential Commission on Good Government, which was tasked to go after the Marcos' ill-gotten wealth. Aquino, being a revolutionary president by virtue of people power, repealed repressive laws under her predecessor, restored civil liberties, abolished the 1973 Marcos Constitution, and dissolved the Marcos allies. Loyalists' supporters dominated Batasang Pambansa. Despite the advice of her vice president and only Prime Minister Salvador Laurel, she also immediately created a constitutional commission, which she directed for the drafting of a new constitution for the nation. On the overall, the Aquino administration made important gains in the aspects of bringing back democracy, restoring investor confidence in the economy and enacting legal and constitutional reforms. Despite these achievements, her presidency faced several threats from both right-wing military elements and extreme left-wing communist rebels. Further, her administration dealt with numerous problems such as major natural disasters which struck the country and severe power shortages which took a toll on doing business in the Philippines. It was also during her tenure that the United States finally ended its military bases and presence in the country. Administration and Cabinet. Ministerial Cabinet, Presidential Cabinet, President. Some of the members of the Aquino administration. Domestic policies. Economy. When Corazon Aquino became president, she inherited an economy that was bankrupt and debt-ridden as a result of 20 years of misrule and mismanagement under the Marcos regime. As president, Aquino focused her attention and energy to revitalize and rejuvenate the sagging economy. One of her boldest moves was to dismantle the various monopolies that were perpetrated by Marcos during his stay in power. She also moved quickly to tackle the issue of the $26 billion foreign debt incurred by her predecessor. Instead of repudiating it, Aquino chose to honor all the debts that were incurred previously under different administrations. Her decision proved to be unpopular, but Aquino defended it, saying that it was the most practical move and choice to make, as it was crucial for the country at the time to regain the confidence of investors and the international community in the Philippine economy. Since 1986, the Aquino administration has paid off $4 billion of the country's outstanding debts to regain good international credit ratings and attract the attention of future markets. Nevertheless, the administration borrowed an additional $9 billion, increasing the national debt by $5 billion within 6 years' time since the ouster of former President Ferdinand Marcos in 1986. Further, the Aquino administration also sought to bring back fiscal discipline in order as it aimed to trim down the government's budget deficit that ballooned during Marcos' term through privatization of bad government assets and deregulation of many vital industries. It was also during Aquino's time that vital economic laws such as the Build-Operate Transfer Law, Foreign Investments Act and the Consumer Protection and Welfare Act were enacted. The economy posted a positive growth of 3.4% during her first year in office, but in the aftermath aftermath of the 1989 coup attempt, the Philippine economy remained stagnant. In her final year in office, inflation was raging at 17%, and unemployment was slightly over 10% higher than the Marcos years. Revolutionary government. Immediately after assuming the presidency, President Aquino issued Proclamation No. 3, which established a revolutionary government. She abolished the 1973 constitution that was in force during martial law, and instead promulgated the provisional 1986 Freedom Constitution, pending the ratification of a new constitution by the people. This allowed Aquino to exercise both executive and legislative powers until the ratification of the new Philippine Constitution and the establishment of a new Congress in 1987. Landmark legislation. As such, Aquino promulgated two landmark legal codes, namely, the Family Code of 1987, which reformed the civil law on family relations, and the Administrative Code of 1987, which reorganized the structure of the executive branch of government. Another landmark law that was enacted during her tenure was the 1991 Local Government Code, which devolved national government powers to local government units. The new code also enhanced the power of LGUs to enact local taxation measures and assured them of a share in the national revenue. Likewise, Aquino closed down the Marcos-dominated Batasang Pambansa to prevent the new Marcos loyalist opposition from undermining her democratic reforms, and reorganized the membership of the Supreme Court to restore its independence. In May 1986, the reorganized Supreme Court declared the Aquino government as not merely a de facto government but, in fact and law, a de jure government, whose legitimacy had been affirmed by the community of nations. This Supreme Court decision significantly affirmed the status of Aquino as the new, legitimate and rightful leader of the Philippines. 1986 Constitutional Commission. To fast-track the restoration of a full constitutional government and the writing of a new charter, President Aquino appointed 48 members of the 1986 Constitutional Commission, led by retired activist Supreme Court Associate Justice Cecilia Munoz Palma. The CONCOM completed its final draft in October 1986. On February 2, 1987, the new Constitution of the Philippines, which put strong emphasis on civil liberties, human rights and social justice, was overwhelmingly approved by the Filipino people. The ratification of the new constitution was followed by the election of senators and Congress that same year and the holding of local elections in 1988. Agrarian reform. Upon her ascension into power, President Aquino envisioned agrarian and land reform as the centerpiece of her administration's social legislative agenda. Her family background and social class as a privileged and landed daughter of a wealthy and landed clan became a lightning rod of criticisms against her land reform agenda. On February 22, 1987, 3 weeks after the resounding ratification of the 1987 Constitution, agrarian workers and farmers marched to the historic Mendiola Street near Malacañang Palace to demand genuine land reform from Aquino's administration. The farmers' march turned bloody and violent when Marine forces fired at farmers who tried to go beyond the designated demarcation line set by the police. As a result, 12 farmers were killed and 19 were injured in this incident now known as the Mendiola Massacre. This tragic incident led some prominent members of the Aquino cabinet like the nationalist and progressive Senator Jose W. Diano to quit from the government posts. Though Aquino did not have any personal and official involvement with the drastic actions taken by some police elements, her administration has been faulted since then for failing to solve land disputes in the country. In response to calls for agrarian reform, President Aquino issued Presidential Proclamation 131 and Executive Order 229 on July 22, 1987, which outlined her land reform program, which included sugar lands. In 1988, with the backing of Aquino, the new Congress of the Philippines passed Republic Act No. 6657, more popularly known as the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. The law paved the way for the redistribution of agricultural lands to tenant farmers from landowners, who were paid in exchange by the government through just compensation but were also allowed to retain not more than 5 hectares of land. Corporate landowners were also allowed under the law to voluntarily divest a proportion of the capital stock, equity or participation in favor of the workers or other qualified beneficiaries, in lieu of turning over the land to the government for redistribution. Despite the flaws in the law, the Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality in 1989, declaring that the implementation of the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, provided by the said law, was a revolutionary kind of expropriation. Despite the implementation of CARP, Aquino was not spared from the controversies that eventually centered on Hacienda Luisita, a 6,453-hectare estate located in the province of Tarlac, which was a shared inheritance among the Cojuangco clan. She was scored for allowing Hacienda Luisita, which was now owned by the Tarlac Development Corporation, to opt for stock distribution, instead of land redistribution. As such, ownership of agricultural portions of the hacienda were transferred to the corporation, which in turn gave its shares of stocks to farmers. The arrangement remained in force until 2006, when the Department of Agrarian Reform revoked the stock distribution scheme adopted in Hacienda Luisita, and ordered instead the redistribution of a large portion of the property to the tenant farmers. The department stepped into the controversy when in 2004, violence erupted over the retrenchment of workers in the hacienda, eventually leaving 7 people dead. Privatization. When Aquino assumed the presidency in 1986, $31 billion, slightly more than 25% of the government's budget, was allocated to public sector enterprises, government-owned or government-controlled corporations, in the form of equity infusions, subsidies, and loans. Aquino also found it necessary to write off $130 billion in bad loans granted by the government's 2 major financial institutions, the Philippine National Bank and the Development Bank of the Philippines, to those who held positions of power and conflicting interest under Marcos. The proliferation of inefficient and unprofitable public sector enterprises and bad loans held by the Philippine National Bank, the Development Bank of the Philippines, and other government entities was a heavy legacy of the Marcos years, burdened with 296 public sector enterprises, plus 399 other non-performing assets transferred to the government by the Philippine National Bank and the Development Bank of the Philippines. The Aquino administration established the Asset Privatization Trust in 1986 to dispose of government-owned and government-controlled properties. By early 1991, the Asset Privatization Trust had sold 230 assets with net proceeds of $14.3 billion. Another 74 public sector enterprises that were created with direct government investment were put up for sale. 57 enterprises were sold wholly or in part for a total of about $6 billion. The government designated that about 30% of the original public sector enterprises be retained and expected to abolish another 20%. There was widespread controversy over the fairness of the divestment procedure and its potential to contribute to an even greater concentration of economic power in the hands of a few wealthy families. Another example for President Aquino is the sequestrement of its Marcos-owned radio and television stations such as the Banahor Broadcasting Corporation, Radio Philippines Network and Intercontinental Broadcasting Corporation after the 1986 EDSA revolution. On July 16 and September 14, 1986, ABS-CBN resumed its operations after 14 years of the closure. Since then, its TV station DWWX-TV and 2 radio stations are open following a reopening. Media and culture. Since 1986, Aquino adopted original Filipino music by implementing Executive Order No. 255 issued on July 25, 1987, which broadcasts hourly OPM songs to all FM radio stations in Metro Manila and in the provinces regularly to shape up Filipino culture. Singers like Regine Velasquez, Randy Santiago, Ogie Alcacid, Gary Valenciano, Manilan Reigns, Donna Cruz and others are contributed to the President's implementation of Filipino music over the airwaves. Stations like DZOO-FM, DWLS, etc. are adopted to early OPMs effectively after the implementation. After the revolution, she removed Maharlika Broadcasting System, a Marcos-owned TV network originally ceased transmitting on February 24, 1986 to replace a new network under the brand name People's Television Network, incorporated in April 1986. In 1992, PTNI made a government broadcaster for the first time under RA 7306 when it was signed. In 1988, GMA Network unveils the new transmitter called the Tower of Power located in Barangay Guliat in Quezon City with a grand opening to mark a nationwide satellite broadcast and for the preparation of a rainbow satellite. The network becomes an instrument of democracy during the revolution. Aquino also encouraged the tourism sector to boost the national economy. Under her 6-year term, the Department of Tourism launched a program called the Philippines Fiesta Islands of Asia in 1989, offers tourist visits in the country to show the natural wonders, to protect their indigenous peoples, to preserve heritage sites and to contribute historical importance. Sports. Under her administration, Filipino athletes brought home several medals in international sports events. The 1986 Asian Games in Seoul, South Korea finished with the Philippines in 6th with 18 medals. In 1988, the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul, athlete Leopoldo Sarance got the bronze medal in the men's light flyweight division of boxing. Manila was to become the host city of the 1991 Southeast Asian Games and the host country finished second place to Indonesia. To ensure the standards of its athletes, the Philippine Sports Commission was established in 1990 as an institution to train future athletes in sports and international events. Foreign policies. U.S. visit. In September 1986, Aquino made her first state visit to the United States. She gave a speech in a joint session of the United States Congress with U.S. lawmakers wearing yellow ribbons symbolizing support to Aquino. United States emergency aid. Following her speech in the United States Congress in 1986, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 203 to 197 in favor of $200 million in emergency aid to her fledgling government. The vote admitted Democrat Gerald Kleshka of Wisconsin, amounted to legislating with our hearts instead of our heads. Indeed, the measure only added to a foreign aid budget that is already likely to be deeply slashed by the Gramm-Rudman budget balancing mechanism. U.S. Bases Extension Treaty. On June 15, 1991, Mount Pinatubo, just 20 miles from Subic Bay, exploded erupted with a force 8 times greater than the Mount St. Helens eruption. Day turned to night as volcanic ash blotted out the sun. Volcanic earthquakes and heavy rain, lightning and thunder from Typhoon Yanya passing over northern Luzon made Black Saturday a 36-hour nightmare. By the morning of June 16, when the volcano's fury subsided, Subic Bay, once one of the most beautiful and well-maintained Navy bases in the Pacific, lay buried under a foot of rain-soaked, sandy ash. Buildings everywhere collapsed under the weight of the coarse gray ash. 2 girls, one a 9-year-old American and the other a Filipino citizen, died when trapped under a falling roof at George Dewey High School. In the city of Olongapo, more than 60 volcano-related deaths were reported, including 8 who were crushed when part of Olongapo General Hospital collapsed. At night, the threat of continued eruptions combined with the lack of water and electricity led to the decision to evacuate all dependents. U.S. warships and cargo planes began the emergency evacuation of thousands of Navy and Air Force dependents. 7 Navy ships sailed Monday, June 17, with 6,200 dependents. A total of 17 ships, including the aircraft carriers US Abraham Lincoln and US Midway, evacuated all 20,000 dependents over the next few days. The evacuees were taken by ship to Mactan Air Base and then were airlifted by U.S. Air Force C-141 Starlifters to Anderson Air Force Base at Guam. After the dependents were evacuated, an intense clean-up was begun. All hands, American service members and Filipino base employees, worked around the clock to restore essential services. Clark Air Base, much closer to Mount Pinatubo, was declared a total loss and plans for a complete closure were started. Within 2 weeks, NAS Cubi Point was back in limited operation. Soon, most buildings had electricity and water restored. By mid-July, service had been restored to most family housing units. The dependents began returning September 8, 1991, and by the end of the month almost all were back at Subic Bay from the United States. Many months before the expiration of the military bases agreement of 1947, intense negotiations between the governments of the United States and the Philippines began. These negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Friendship, Peace and Cooperation between the United States and the Republic of the Philippines. This would have extended the lease of the American bases in the Philippines. On September 13, 1991, the Philippine Senate rejected the ratification of this treaty, citing a number of reasons for the rejection. This was a devastating blow to the Aquino administration, who were strongly pro-treaty and even called for a referendum by the Filipino people, a move that was declared unconstitutional. In December 1991, the two governments were again in talks to extend the withdrawal of American forces for 3 years, but this broke down as the United States refused to detail their withdrawal plans or to answer if nuclear weapons were kept on base. Finally, on December 27, President Corazon Aquino, who had previously fought to delay the U.S. pullout to cushion the country's battered economy, issued a formal notice for the U.S. to leave by the end of 1992. Naval Station Subic Bay was the U.S.'s largest overseas defense facility after Clark Air Base was closed. During 1992, tons of material including tridents and equipment were shipped to various naval stations. Ship repair and maintenance yards as well as supply depots were relocated to other Asian countries including Japan and Singapore. Finally, on November 24, 1992, the American flag was lowered in Subic for the last time, and the last 1,416 sailors and Marines at Subic Bay Naval Base left by plane from Nas-Cuba, pointed by the US Bellewood. This withdrawal marked the first time since the 16th century that no foreign military forces were present in the Philippines. Japanese relations. President Corazon Aquino vies for the wrongs committed by Japan during World War II. New foreign aid agreements also were concluded during this visit. Aquino returned to Japan in 1989 for Hirohito's funeral and in 1990 for the enthronement of Emperor Akihito. A series of talks of 4 prime ministers from Yasuhiro Nakasone from 1986 to 1987, Takeshi Miyazawa from 1991 to 1992. The Japanese government provided economic and trade relations between the two countries, massive inflow of Japanese investors and tourists, rehabilitation and construction of schools, hospitals and roads, and guaranteed justice for Filipino-camped women after World War II. Also, in an official state visit, she and Prime Minister Noboru Takeshita received condolences in the wake of MV Donya Paz tragedy. Soviet relations. Ivan Aquino meets Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in another state visit in Moscow for the first time in 1987. She and Gorbachev agreed that the Philippines and the Soviet Union established the two-nation economic ties and to promote the reforms based on the perestroika and glasnost systems, paved their way to democracy. It also includes a Philippine-Soviet friendship. She returned between 1991 and 1992 for the state visit with President Boris Yeltsin since Russia was independent on December 25, 1991. Chinese and South Korean relations. Then in China, a state visit between Aquino and Chinese Premier Deng Xiaoping for the first time in 1988. The two leaders discussed the economic relations between the Philippines and China to receive its economic and trading partnership and a Philippine-Chinese friendship under Xiaoping. Also in the state visit, she visited Hongjian villages, ancestral homes of the Kanjankos, where her grandparents and children were born and raised in this village before they descended into the Philippines. Later went to South Korea between 1986 and 1988 for separate meetings with Presidents Chun Doo-Hwan and Roh Tae-woo in relation to Philippine-South Korean economic, social and cultural ties. She represented in the Asian Games and the Olympics by supporting the Filipino athletes in the world of sports. She and Tae-woo also discussed about unification talks in which South and North Korea will unify to end its hostilities since the Korean War in the 1950s. Aquino's European tour. In Europe, the president went to the United Kingdom and meets British Prime Ministers Margaret Thatcher and John Major from 1987 to 1992 to discuss important talks on economy and social welfare as the Philippines provide economic and financial assistance programs, and strong commercial ties between the two countries. Also in London, she visited Queen Elizabeth II and received a warm welcome for the first time. Similar visits were made by Aquino, and she went to other European nations including with President François Mitterrand of France, President Francesco Cossiga of Italy, Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany and Prime Minister Felipe González Marquez of Spain from 1986 to 1991. In Spain and Vatican City, Aquino meets King Juan Carlos I of Spain for a special visit in which the country traced back to historical timeline during the Spanish rule for over 3 centuries and how the country received freedom after its independence, and the revolution made the president and the Spanish king a two-nation friendship. later went to the Vatican, and she also received a warm welcome to Pope John Paul II. John Paul II congratulates Aquino for supporting millions of Filipinos whose march to TDSA and to topple the dictator in this Roman Catholic nation. Is in UN relations. Aquino made her first state visits in Southeast Asia. She went to Singapore, then to Indonesia in August 1986, for separate meetings with Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and Indonesian President Suharto in order to provide trade and economic ties between the three countries. She also went to Malaysia in November 1987 to discuss territorial disputes in Sabah with Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, and in Thailand and Brunei for separate meetings with Prime Minister Prem Tin Silanonda in April 1988, and Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah in August 1988. She and the member leaders of Association of Southeast Asian Nations made meetings in various ASEAN summits from 1986 to 1992. Aquino went to the United Nations Assembly in New York in July 1988, made a historic speech during the 45th General Assembly. In her historic speech, Aquino promised to the international community in expressing democratic freedoms in countries since the Philippines received freedom after the revolution in 1986, and to provide a resolution in the protection for migrant workers and the families. During the July 1988 visit, she met Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar for a special meeting to discuss anti-poverty and anti-insurgency measures in the Philippines. 1987 legislative elections. Lakas-ang Bayan coalition composed of PDP Laban, Lakas-ang Bansa, UNIDO, Liberal Party Silonga Wing, National Union of Christian Democrats, Philippine Democratic Socialist Party, Bandila and Pinagua Uso. Grand Alliance for Democracy coalition composed of the Nationalista Party, Kilusang Bagong Lipunan, Liberal Party Ka Wing, Partido Nacionalista en Pilipinas, Christian Socialist Democratic Party, Mindanao Alliance and Muslim Federal Party. UPPKBL coalition composed of pro-Marcos forces. Aquino's administration coalition won 22 out of the 24 Senate seats.